Diane Fossey was a rather different cup of tea. She lived in a camp was in a very different environment. I think it was about 9,000 feet in the, I'm not sure whether it was as high as that, but I think it was, in the Virunga volcanoes. Gorilla were much more difficult to see than the chimpanzees. I remember one time when we went out, soon after I got there, we tracked them for several hours and eventually came up on them. And they were habituated to her, but as soon as they saw me, they took off. And Diane turned to me and said, "Robert, they think you're a silverback. Put your hat on," because my hair had recently gone grey. And I never had the courage to do the experiment properly and take it off again on future occasions. Diane lived in a more disease-free but much more unpleasant environment on top of these volcanoes. And what I learnt about her, which not many people know, is that she had an absolute phobia of heights. And one day, a photographer, Alan Root, and I and Diane and a research student of mine, a former research student called Thelma Rowell, were tracking the gorilla, and the gorilla went down a deep sort of crevasse down the volcano and up the other side, and we had the choice of going down and up, or no, sorry, they crossed the crevasse. We had the choice of going down and up and climbing up the steep cliff on the other side. And Alan Root said to me, who he knew Diane much better than I did at that point, "Robert, you go first, then Diane, then me and Thelma at the back, and then we'll be all right." And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I clambered up this cliff and got just about to the top, and Diane was behind me, and she froze and couldn't move. And he pushed from behind, and I reached down from on top and got hold of her flies and of her trousers and pulled, and all the fly buttons came off, but we got her up to the top, and she just sat there for several minutes frozen and then went on again. And I think it's a tribute to her enormous courage that she continued to work for years and years and years on those mountains when she had this fear of heights. One thing I'd like to say about that period in my life is that it was a wonderful time at Madingley, because we had these field workers coming back to write up their stuff or preparing to go out into the field, and there was a wonderful camaraderie in the lab at that time, which has not been quite the same. Well, I mustn't say that because I haven't been there all the time, but it was, I think, very remarkable. And one of them said to me only yesterday, he was visiting from the States, that they all looked back on that time as a very unique time, and that they didn't know any other laboratory that had that sort of feeling about it. People coming from, on the whole, rather nasty places, and passionately interested in animals, passionately interested in their research, and being able to communicate with each other because there was no rivalry or anything of that sort.
The three people who I sort of vaguely associate with, but I don't know whether they were linked or not, were Pat Bateson.
He was my student early on. He was my first, almost my first student on imprinting, yes.
But was he at Madingley?
Oh yes.
Yeah. And the other is Nick Humphrey?
Nick Humphrey came to Madingley as a visitor. Let's not talk about Nick. He's a friend of mine, but I think it's sad that he hasn't achieved more.
Well, I remember him telling me that he'd taken a Faustian compact at some party, which was when he went into television. And
Yes. Yes.
the other was, I'm trying to remember his double-barreled name. He was at King's, who worked on Red Deer. Cotton Brock. Was he anything to do? He was at something to do with the research centre.
Yes, at the research centre, yes.
Yeah.
And he's done very well indeed.
Yeah.
He's responsible for meerkats being a popular animal everywhere.
Is he? I didn't know that. So this was a really wonderful time. You were aged between roughly what and what when this was happening?
Well, let's say in 1968 I would have been 45.
Born in 23, were you?
Born in 23,
Yeah.
yes.
45.
And it was in the next decade after that, really. Or 15 years after that.
Was this, I mean, often research laboratory groups like the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, which I knew well, have a great moment of charismatic enthusiasm at the beginning, in the first 10 years, because you said earlier, they have a focused problem and they don't really mind about the disciplines. But as with Max Weber, charisma can turn to routinization over time rather easily. Do you think that was part of it? This was a very good time to be studying?
It was a very good time, but it was, I mean, it didn't come at the beginning. It came in the middle of my time at Madingley. And it was the coming together of these lovely young people. And they weren't all in Africa. I've had students on Cayo Santiago, for instance, and Puerto Rico, in South Africa. It was a very happy time. It was also happy for me in that I was married for the second time after a rather sticky divorce in 1971, I think it was.
So what was the next phase in your life after that?
Well, I decided that, I have to say, and this sounds a very funny thing to say, but I've always wanted to make the world a better place. I think I had 3 uncles in the church, and maybe that had something to do with it.
Yes.
And my father had intended to be a medical missionary, but lost his faith when he was an undergraduate at Emmanuel. And that's always been very important to me. And when I was first a fellow at St John's, there were 5 historians in the college, fellows, all of whom became very distinguished subsequently. And they used to laugh at me and they'd say, here's young Hinde, he thinks he's going to make the world a better place. We historians, by studying chaffinches behind a pub in Madingley, we historians, we know the world will never be a better place. And I used to think there were a lot of cynical bastards.
One of them became a master, did he, or was that?
Yeah, Hensley was
Hensley.
Yes. But they were all, Thistlethwaite, who was a well-known American historian, Robinson, who was professor at Oxford. Anyway. Robinson
and Gallagher, yes. So how were you going to make the world a better place?
And so I wanted to, I thought it's really better to study children than study monkeys. And so I recruited Judy Dunn, who you know, to the unit, and she helped me get interested in child development. But I was really interested in mother-child relations, and we didn't agree about attachment theory, that's another issue. But what happened was that she pursued her own work, and I started a study with my second wife, Joan Stevenson Hinde, of 4-year-olds and their mothers. And I worked in nursery schools with the 4-year-olds, and she worked in the homes. And it was a wonderful time for me because I was the white-haired professor who came to watch the children, but I was also the only man about the place who got sent out to clear the snow out of the gutters or mend the fuses or sweep up the floor after school, that sort of thing. You can't work in a nursery school unless you become part of it. And we did a certain amount of worthwhile work, but Joan got interested in shyness in children, and she's gone on to do really very remarkable work, so that she's a sort of international figure in the attachment field. My work has been, I tried too hard to use the recording techniques which are done so well for monkeys, for children, and they just weren't applicable. And in a certain sense I wasted a certain amount of those years. They weren't especially fruitful years.
What were they recording? You mean film or tapes?
No, pencil and paper.
You mean noting the number of interactions and this sort of thing?
Yes, on a check sheet.
Yeah.
Well, mostly it was audio tape, which we subsequently coded.
Yeah.
But Joan has done wonderful things since then, and is still writing papers about the relation between the mother's personality and shyness in children in relation to their relationship.
Yeah.
In attachment theory terms.
How did you think that studying 4-year-old children, it's not perhaps as irrelevant as chaffinches behind the pub, but how was this going to make the world a better place?
Well, I thought if we understand how humans behave, and it's exactly what you think too,
Yes,
so
yeah.
don't beat around the bush.
Yes.
That you've thought the same thing, I'm sure.
Yes, I have. Yes. But I like to hear it coming back to me from other people. Again, I wondered whether you'd thought of doing something comparative. I mean, I've done 2 studies of 4-year-olds, or rather 2 studies of children growing up from the age of 2 to the age of 10, using film and participant observation as an anthropologist, namely a little girl growing up in the Himalayas in Nepal and her interactions with her mother, who was my adopted sister, over that period, and also my granddaughter, or step-granddaughter, which is rather important because they're not my blood.
Yeah.
And I've been filming and observing them until now, which is 10-year-old. And what I want to do one day is to do a comparative study to see what's in common, what's different about this very intense, not just in a school, but the whole of life, you know, not the toilet, but
Sure.
almost everything else, the bathing, the washing, the cleaning, the grooming.
Sure.
Because what strikes me, obviously, at the first impression is the similarities. Although, you know, one is a Buddhist culture in Annapurna Mountains and one is a little Australian girl in Cambridgeshire, but the eye movements, everything you can pick out on film, the mouth, the contacts between her and her mother, and the teaching and the art and everything, a lot of similarity.
Yes. Tell me something, when you were working in Nepal, did you come across, well, I'll tell you why I asked. I had an acupuncture treatment for a while with someone for a muscle thing, and she told me that she'd worked for Save the Children Fund in Nepal and had come across 3 or 4 cases of grandmothers lactating while they looked after the children.
I've seen it, yes.
You've seen it too, that's very interesting.
Yes. I mean, 2 or 3 cases I've seen in the village. I mean, I'd have to check with my wife, who has a better knowledge of this, but it'll all be in our database. And you know, you actually saw this 40, 50, 60-year-old lady giving breastfeeding, and it just been through arousal, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting.
Anyway, let's come back to children and saving the world. The other part of saving the world was, which is very important, is your very distinguished work in relation to Pugwash and...
well, that comes much later.
Okay, well, you take it in order then. What's next?
During that period of the 80s, 70s, 80s, I started a thing in Cambridge called the Cambridge Association Against Nuclear Warfare or something like that. And we had, Pat was involved in it too, in a dilatory sort of way.
Pat Bateson, yes.
Yes. And we had a series of lectures and meetings and so on. And then I got involved in ex-servicemen's CND. The point there being that CND was always portrayed on the media as being long-haired hippies with torn jeans and all that sort of thing. And we used to go along on the parades with our best suits on and our medals and grey hair and all that sort of thing, and try and make it respectable. And I remember standing outside the Cenotaph in a demonstration we were doing one day, and meeting a friend who worked in one of the ministries, coming and saying, what are you doing here?
Matter out of place, yes.
And from that, I graduated into Pugwash. And Pugwash, as you know, do you know?
Yes.
Do I have to say this?
Well, say it a little, because I did interview Martin Rees, and he explained quite a bit about Pugwash, but
yes.
That's a separate interview, so tell us about it.
Pugwash is an organisation that grew out of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which Einstein's was probably the last thing Einstein ever signed, and was really motivated by Bertrand Russell in 1955 against nuclear weapons. But it gave rise to a series of conferences which are called the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, the first meeting of which was held in 1957 and involved scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain, and has had, I think it's 57 annual meetings in 50 years or something in the best traditions, and also many workshops, mostly on nuclear weapons, but on many other aspects of science and human affairs in the meanwhile. And eventually got the Nobel Peace Prize was divided between the movement and its main motivator, Sir Joseph Roteblat, in 1995. And I became involved in that in the 80s, and it works primarily, or did work then, primarily at the political level, and tries to get the right scientific insights across to the politicians. And the politicians have listened because of its impeccable scientific integrity. Joe Roteblat would never exaggerate the effects of a nuclear weapon or anything of that sort. He always said it has to be absolutely accurate. And that's taken, in retirement, has taken up a lot of my time. And but can I come to that in due course?
Yeah.
In 1989, I was somewhat against my will elected Master of St. John's, because but I was due to retire from my research professorships at 65, so I didn't mind too much, but it meant I couldn't do any research, or much research, for 5 years. I really enjoyed being master in many ways. What I liked about it was terrible, but being a sort of centre of things, and you'd walk across the court and meet a porter who had something to say to you, or senior tutor, or one of the undergraduates, or the lady superintendent, and you felt as though you were in the middle of the web, as it were. And I did enjoy that feeling very much. I had to spend a lot of time raising money for a new undergraduate library. One of the troubles with you sitting in the window is that I want to look out at the light somehow, so it's difficult for me to keep on looking at it.
Well, look at the light. It doesn't make too much difference.
What was I going to say?
You were raising money for this
raising
library.
money for the library. And I did about 60 meetings all over the country and in the States and Canada and France and places. And they were quite fun in a way, although I resented the time on them, because the people who used to come were the loyal Jonians. And I used to give them a couple of drinks and then give them a little talk about how badly we needed money, and ask for questions, and I was always terrified that they'd ask me questions about the accounts, which I wasn't really too good on. But the commonest question I had was, tell me, Master, do the porters still wear top hats? You know, all the nostalgia came out, and it was really lovely, actually.
The famous porters of St. John's.
Yes.
Head porter of St. John's, worldwide acclaim. And you raised some money.
And we raised several million, which enabled us to build, I think, a very satisfactory undergraduate library. Big debates as to whether it was right to have it open all night or whether the undergraduates ought to be going to sleep, which eventually it was agreed that it would stay open all night. And I remember looking out of my window in the Master's Lodge, which I was then occupying, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and seeing 7 heads bent over desks, and I thought, it's working.
Well,
nice,
as long as they weren't bent over in sleep. Yeah. So, you mainly enjoyed it. There must have been, apart from not being able to get on with your research, were there any other downsides?
No, John's, if I may say this to a fellow of King's, is a lovely college.
I'm sure
it was a very cooperative college at that time, and I had no major rows of any sort to deal with. It was, everybody was really motivated in the same way, and that was really very nice. I had a new domestic bursar, but he was very good and settled into the job very quickly.
The dispute about women in St. John's was before your time.
It was before my time.
That
was, well, everybody was happy about that, or at least pretended they were happy, so there were no problems. You know, the building of the library was the big issue, and that did take up a lot of my time. I did write some papers during that period, but I couldn't. I began to feel itchy because, having had a Royal Society professorship and having done nothing but research all my life, really, it was a bit of a...
So you've never been heavily involved in lecturing, for instance, university lecturing? No.
When I was an assistant director of research in SAR, I used to give a course of lectures on animal behaviour in zoology, and I continued to give a few lectures every year, and from about, I don't know when it was, but I suppose about the mid-90s or early 90s, I've been lecturing on personal relationships to social and political scientists. And I gave that up when I was 80 because I thought it was improper for somebody of 80 to be lecturing on love to young students. Still, Joan and I are involved in a course of lectures in psychology, and I give 2 of them. So I still have
a niche.
A little bit, but not anything you'd call a teaching load.
You like lecturing? Enjoy it?
Yes, I do quite. I'd like to have done more. My contact to although I was a tutor in John's for several years, I missed that out. Can I go back?
Yes, yes.
In the 50s, when I was very insecure and didn't have a proper job, St John's made me steward, and I was in charge of the food in the hall and of the undergraduates' wine cellar. And what John's didn't know was that I had no taste buds and no special interest in either wine or food.
Perhaps they did know.
But
anyway.
There'd been a kitchen manager in the post for 40-something years, so nothing I could say made any difference. But I learned a very important lesson from the wine merchants who came to see me every term, because I learned that if you say to each one what the previous one said to you, you only make a fool of yourself once a term. And that was about once in 10 times or something. And I reckon that I've been through my life not minding if I made a fool of myself once in 10 times, and that's probably paid off. And then after 2 or 3 years they got fed up with me as steward and made me a tutor instead. And I enjoyed that, and gave me some contact with undergraduates, which I haven't personal contact with undergraduates. I mean, most of my contact has been with graduate students rather than undergraduates, and that was a good period. And I did that until 1963, when I got so I did it for about 5 years, when I got the Royal Society Research Professorship, which had one strict rule, and that is you mustn't do anything you don't want to do attached to it. And I had to give up supervising.
Sounds like something out of Oscar Wilde. I have a strict rule. I'm sorry, I'd love to do this, but I'm precluded from doing anything I really don't want to do, and I really don't want to do this, so I can't.
I know it was Oscar Wilde's idea, but it was really what a Royal Society Research Professorship.
I made it up, but it's sort of Bunburying of some kind.
Yes.
A tutor, I ought to explain, wasn't a supervisor. You were a sort of moral tutor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
that was the end of the national service period. So I had some national servicemen and some straight undergraduates. That was quite interesting too.
Returning to the Pugwash and the CND, I know that you've written and edited books on war and its causes. I've lectured on war, and I've come to the conclusion that there are too many causes for me to. I mean, you really have to differentiate between the levels of civilization. The causes of war in the modern world are not the same as those in the Yanomamo and the American Indians and so on. But out of all that work, did you come to any particular conclusions about?
Yes, which aren't too different from yours, I think. We mustn't have an argument about it. But I think there are an infinite number of causes of war, including things like poverty and land disputes and so on. But there are two things which are, well, first of all, that you've got to make a distinction between aggression of individuals, gang warfare, and institutionalized war, in which they're differentiated roles. And that's what we're really talking about most of the time. I don't know where war between Indian tribes would come on that, but somewhere in the middle. And that if you're going to have institutionalized war, then two things are essential and can be seen as the causes in a sense. One is the supply of weapons, and the other is young people willing to carry them. And my view is that although aggressiveness plays a part, the real issue is duty. And the pilot embarks on a mission not because he wants to kill people the other side, but because that's his duty. The tank commander advances because that's his duty. And it's a big institution, and the munition workers make weapons because that's their duty, and the transport workers make weapons, carry the weapons to the front because that's their duty, and so on. And the medics have their duties role particular role, and that duty is the main issue, and that this institution is supported at three levels really. One is an everyday level. I'm only saying this on the condition that you tell me where you disagree with me.
No, no, I'm just listening.
One is the everyday level of the way history is taught, of stories about war, novels about war, films about war, and all that. Male chauvinism a bit. The second is cultural issues that persist over time, like the belligerence of the culture, patriotism nationalism as opposed to patriotism, and so on. And the third level is the military, industrial, scientific complex, which itself is a nested series of sub-institutions, each of which is supported primarily by the career ambitions of those involved. That's my picture of it. Does that disagree very much?
No, not at all. I agree with everything. My views are put forward to my granddaughter Lily in the Why Do We Fight letter to her, which goes along the same lines. I think the most forceful thing which I drew out of it is that this naive assumption that the individual psychological drive of aggression has much to do with modern warfare, and indeed war in many societies is mistaken. I came across this most forcefully in my life when I went to work in the Himalayas with the people who were recruited into the Gurkhas, because these are famed as the greatest medal winners and the most fierce people in the world, with their kukris and all the rest of it. But they were the very gentlest, non-aggressive people I've ever met. Once they get inside the structure of the British Army, they become very good soldiers, not because they are in the slightest bit aggressive, but because they obey their seniors and do what they're told without too much questioning. So the personal, psychological and the institutional are hardly congruent at all. So that was...
that's very interesting. It's exactly what I think that the problem comes from a confusion between aggression and aggressiveness.
Yes, exactly.
And when Germany walks into Poland, that's an act of aggression, but it doesn't imply that individual aggressiveness is involved at all.
Exactly. And I came across the same thing in studying Japan, because I spent a lot of time talking about the Japanese behaviour. And individual Japanese I know are almost uniformly very peaceful, very calm, very non-aggressive people. But the context changes and their loyalties particularly get inflamed, and they become extremely aggressive in certain ways. But there's nothing instinctive or basic individual psychology to do with it. Anyway, so I agree with you, but
There's
tell me what you think.
Book by a very interesting book by somebody who, an anthropologist, a Japanese anthropologist who works at Madison, Wisconsin, on the kamikaze pilots, showing, it's called Cherry Blossom or something like that, showing how they didn't want to kill themselves, but the system was set up so that they somehow couldn't escape from it.
Well, I may land you with another book on Japan. We'll talk about that later. The other sort of theme that, again, I may be jumping too far ahead, but you're particularly interested in, I know, is religion and the causes thereof and the effects thereof, both religion and ethics. What do you think led to this interest, and what's it revolved around?
Well, it stemmed from, I'm sure, my upbringing and my four clerical uncles. My mother, who was absolutely not very highly educated, passive, very wonderful, going to church and getting, I'm sure, something out of it, because it was the thing that did. And my father's questioning his religion as a student and becoming an agnostic, but reverting to it in his old age, actually. And as I told you, I became an agnostic on this voyage during the war, and I put the whole thing on the back burner, and thought I didn't have to bother about that anymore. And when I retired, I thought I'd get back to it. So when I was Master of John's, I wrote a book on relationships and tried to bring that together and did some stuff on war. But I also wrote a book called Why Gods Persist, which is trying to use all the biology and psychology and social science that I'd learnt over the years to bear on the question of why people believe in gods, and why religion is so powerful. And I'm not keen on Richard Dawkins'
I was wondering about that.
denigration of religion, because I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. And the reason it persists is that a lot of people do get a lot out of it. And I could go into that in detail, but we won't bother now, I think. And I think there are two things that are wrong with that approach. One is that the religion is treated as a unitary entity, whereas following Malinowski, I would want to divide it into the structural beliefs, the narratives, the ritual, the moral code, the social aspects, and religious experience. And I think that each of those 6 elements are mutually supportive, but each of them can be to the advantage of individuals in some way. I'm less clear about religious experience, but the only progress I could make with religious experience, because I don't have it, is to see that the language in which people describe religious experience is very, very similar to the language that people use to describe aesthetic experience, except for the interpretation. And the interpretation is the specific thing about religious experience, so that you don't get Christians who've had visions of Buddha, for instance. So it's a sort of experience that's on top of the religious beliefs and so on. That's another issue. Anyway, then I got to feel that morality is the most important thing in the world today, and that part of the problems in the world are, although religion's done a wonderful job in purveying morality down the centuries, in this country at any rate, it's losing its grip a bit, and morality, we need really to understand where morality comes from and what its nature is. And so I wrote a book called Why Good is Good, trying to show that, well, the view is that what's basic and cross-cultural is something like do as you would be done by, or some aspect of it, and that you can, is compatible with or stems from the importance of exchange, and so on, and how moral precepts are passed on by an interaction between what people do and what they're supposed to do. sorry, I missed out a stage in that argument, which is that the do as you would be done by and exchange are sort of basic building blocks, but each society produces its own precepts which are compatible with that, but suit local conditions. So that the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill thy neighbour, you have to say thy neighbour, is compatible with do as you would be done by.
You have to say thy neighbour, but I don't remember Jesus saying thy neighbour. Or
you don't remember him? No.
I mean, you've added that.
But no, I haven't added it. There's a view amongst Hebrew scholars that
the linguistic...
all those commandments should be qualified by thy neighbour. And the last one, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, is not the only one that refers to neighbour. And as you know, it comes in the Bible twice and there's dispute about it. But I insist on it being thy neighbour because we know very little about the evolution, or did know very little about the evolution of why people are nice and good. And the hypothesis that's getting more and more support is because early humans lived in groups which competed with each other, and you have to be cooperative, nice to people in your own group, but not in with the out group. So that's why I say that. And groups devised their own precepts, and the Ten Commandments are not universally applicable because they aren't applicable to people who don't have a institution of marriage, for instance. And that they're passed down through a dialectic between what people do and what they're supposed to do, so that in my lifetime that dialectic has led to divorce becoming more acceptable. When I was a boy in the 30s, it was completely
unacceptable.
Outside the pale. I've just finished another book which I think goes a little bit further and is trying to use an objective approach about how morality actually works in the real world. And when you come to look at it, we have rules, but in nearly every case we have a means of excusing ourselves from them. And I don't want to go into the whole business of the self-system now, but if you get accused of being something that you think you are not, like being dishonest, you either try to prove that you were honest, or that they are mistaken and they are inaccurate, or that you were being honest, really. But where this becomes important is in many aspects, institutions in our society, behaviour that is incompatible with the Golden Rule is either condoned or even encouraged. And in business, there's a thing called business ethics. You no longer do as you would be done by, you do the best for yourself. And that's justified by the economists saying it's good for the consumer. Competition is good for the consumer. And I think that's one of the exaggeration of that point of view is one of the worst things in the world today. In war, soldiers are encouraged to kill the outgroup. Politicians, by political necessity, have to lie some of the time. It's understandable that they lie, and so on. So that in each separate institution has its own way of excusing people from breaking rules. In law, for instance, you can't have a legal system without barristers who defend people that they aren't sure that they're not guilty, or accuse people who they think might be. And you have to have judges and jailers and things who are doing things that are completely incompatible with the non-verbal, with the
with the Bible, certainly, with the Golden Rule. Fascinating. Well, I look forward to that. What have we left out? You know your life better than I do. Are there any major people, any major themes that...
There are lots of people who've come into my life incidentally, like J.B.S. Haldane, for instance, was very encouraging to young people studying animal behaviour when I was starting off. He was a wonderful man. My first public lecture, apart from the Oxford one, was to the Zoological Society at University College, and it was a complete and total and utter disaster, because two students, one of whom was John Maynard Smith and the other was G.P. Wells, let a bat go into the auditorium, and it flitted in and out of the projector beam, and the whole audience was in hysterics the whole time, and I had an absolute terrible cold and could hardly speak. And J.B.S. Haldane came up to me afterwards and he said, "Hind, what you need is a drink. Let's go." And we went to the Marlborough Arms, and I remember him pushing me into a train later.
How sweet. Did you know C.H. Waddington, Caroline's?
No, I didn't know him, but of course I came across his work a lot.
What about themes? Any? I mean, you've had such a broad range of topics. We haven't touched on things that we've discussed, like incest behaviour and incest avoidance and kinship, and there are many others. But have we?
Well, that's all intrinsic to incest avoidance. Is the very interesting case of cultural precepts, of which biologists have one explanation and anthropologists have another. And I maintain that they're not wholly incompatible. I mean, there is hard evidence that inbreeding in humans is deleterious, but it's perfectly true that many marriage rules have nothing to do with close relationships, but with close genetic relationship, but may nevertheless have stemmed from that feeling that you mustn't, it's not a good thing to have children with a close relative. I mean, that's a very interesting case. There are lots of things like that we could talk about, but I think that would take us too far afield, probably.
Well, you've very kindly talked for an hour and 45 minutes, so probably, unless there's anything else you'd like to say.
You're satisfied?
More than satisfied.
Okay.
Very happy. Thank you very much indeed, Robert.
My pleasure.